All right, welcome to this episode of the Visionary Experience. Today, we are very fortunate to have Mr. Richard Rothstein, the author of, as you can see here on the screen, if you're looking at the screen, The Color of Law. So, Mr. Rothstein, thank you so much for joining us today. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you. I look forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to speak with you briefly beforehand as well. So really, as I do my podcast and I have different guests, I really look forward just to the conversation. And as we had mentioned before, it's really not an interview because there's a lot of knowledge that's specifically within this book, but also I'm sure in the other research that you've done. And so with that, can you share with myself and also with our listeners, what was the impetus? What was the motivation behind you writing the book, The Color of Law?
Well, I spent many years writing about education policy. I really didn't know much about housing policy or the history of residential segregation. Uh, I was writing about education policy, and I came to the conclusion that the education policy that this country was following in the 1990s and 2000s made no sense.
Mm-hmm.
We noted that there was an achievement gap between Black and white children, as Black children on average achieved at lower levels than white children. And we came up with this explanation that was shared across the political spectrum, that the reason that African American children achieved at lower levels than white children on average was because teachers had low expectations of Black children. They just didn't try very hard.
Mm-hmm.
If only we could force them to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. And we passed a law in 2001, the No Child Left Behind law, that said if only we test children every year, hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores, the achievement gap will disappear in 7 years. That was the theory. It was nonsense, in my view, and I wrote a lot of articles and columns criticizing that. For example, I remember writing an article about asthma. As you may know, African American children in low-income neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous gap. And the reason they have asthma is they live in more polluted neighborhoods. There are more trucks driving through. Their buildings are dilapidated, not well maintained. There's more vermin in the environment. And I tried to explain in this article I wrote that if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma. It's not true in every case, but just more likely to be up at night wheezing. And then coming to school drowsy the next day or sleepless. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, the same racial composition of the groups, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group's going to have lower average achievement, simply from being sleepier when it comes to school. And it's not going to make a big difference, but then when you begin to think of all of the social and economic challenges that African American children in particular in low-income neighborhoods come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. You add them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. It doesn't leave much unexplained that you can attribute to low teacher expectations. So this is what I was thinking about in those days, and I realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can that school ever, no matter how many laws we pass, be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where the children come well rested, well nourished, in good health, and economically secure homes? You can't. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years. So I began to think that school segregation was the biggest problem we faced. And then I realized that the reason schools are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem, a school problem. And that if I was writing about education, I needed to understand something about residential segregation. That's how I initially came to this topic. There's a lot more to say about it than that,
Sure.
but that's just an introduction to how I came to be working on this topic.
Got it. No, I appreciate it. I like to typically kind of work kind of back and forth, but you said something that reminded me of something that you wrote in the book. And I believe it's in 1991, there was an EPA study that you talked about in your book where African Americans were more likely to live near waste dumps and waste areas. And so, how did you come upon that particular research and the effects that it would have specifically on the African American and minority communities?
Well, I don't remember specifically how I came upon that research. I'm a researcher. I dig
Sure.
up articles all the time.
All over the place, right?
But,
Right.
but the point is that I was able to combine the understandings I got from that report with other research I had been doing, which showed that when zoning officials designed zoning in many, many cities in this country, they permitted polluting industries, toxic dumps, industrial facilities to be located in neighborhoods where African Americans were living. And the reverse happened as well. If there were polluting industries, those were the only places, in many cases, where African Americans were permitted to find housing. So the excessive pollution, with its enormous health consequences that African American children in particular are exposed to, is a direct result of residential segregation that was explicit on the part of the federal, state, and local governments. There was an explicit policy of racial segregation. We have this national myth. We tell ourselves we've got something like that we call de facto segregation, that the reason we were so segregated is just natural. It's accidental. It's because of private bigotry and private businesses like banks and real estate agencies and developers who discriminated, or because people like to live with each other of the same race, we tell ourselves, or maybe it's all income differences, but not government. Government had nothing to do with this. It's not like the segregation of schools or lunch counters or buses that we addressed in the 20th century. And this myth is paralyzing, because if we believe that residential segregation happened accidentally or naturally, we have to expect that it can only unhappen accidentally or naturally. And in fact, the courts have said that if government wasn't involved in creating it, government is prohibited from taking explicit action to fix it. So understanding, and this issue that we've just been talking about the explicit placement of industrial and polluting facilities in Black neighborhoods by government agencies, by zoning boards. And this is a tiny, tiny aspect of the problem, but understanding that government at all levels, federal, state, and local, is responsible for creating the segregation we know is essential, because once we understand that,
Right.
then it's no longer an expectation that it can unhappen naturally. Then we understand it's a civil rights violation. Residential segregation is a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution, because government imposed it in a variety of ways. And as American citizens, we have an obligation to redress it, to fix it.
Absolutely. And can you explain to our listeners how and why the government said, okay, housing discrimination is not equivalent to racial discrimination, because that was part of the rationale that was used, I believe, by the Supreme Court, from reading in the book, and from various authorities that they use as a foundation towards certain laws. So is that accurate?
Well, the Supreme Court has refused to recognize the history that and it's incontrovertible, the history that I've described in this book. The book has been out now for 4 years. No historian has challenged a single fact in it. It's indisputable that the reason we have metropolitan segregation everywhere in the country is because of government policy and government actions. The Supreme Court refuses to recognize this. Let me give you this example. I was talking before about how I came to this topic by being concerned about school segregation. Well, in 2007, the Supreme Court looked at a policy in Louisville, Kentucky, that was making a very trivial attempt to desegregate its schools. It gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, it wouldn't be honored. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference. Help to desegregate the school. Trivial program. You don't have one place left very often. Both the black and the white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He said that it's true the schools in Louisville are segregated. He said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. That's true also. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Louisville are segregated de facto for all the non-governmental reasons that I described before. And he concluded that if the government had nothing to do with segregating Louisville, then the government is prohibited from doing anything to desegregate it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky. There was an all-white suburb of single-family homes, all whites. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in that suburb. The suburb's name was Shively. He had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment with a wife and a daughter. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to buy a home in the suburbs. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in the suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop this. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to an African-American in a white neighborhood. Now, the police, the courts, the criminal justice system, these are state actors. These are agents of state government, right, of local government. This is not de facto segregation. This is state-sponsored violence to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville. I looked into it first. This was actually the first thing I looked into when I began to write this book. I looked into it further and I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes police organized and led, mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods all across the country, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, Kansas City, Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco. You can name any city. You can find examples of police protected mob violence. And I concluded after thinking about this that this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. But John Roberts still baldly stated that the government had nothing to do with segregating Louisville. It was all personal choice and private bigotry.
Yeah, and that makes it really makes no sense. And you used a word that has piqued my interest, and you said the word design. And so what that makes me think is, going back to the Constitution and the 3/5 rule, right? When African Americans were looked at as property, which really, okay, well now if we were 3/5 of an individual, but then it made whole individuals. That's why we have the Electoral College today, which we won't get into. But, that's part of the reason. And, when I read your book, it makes me think of, okay, you have the symptoms of things that are going on, and you have those kind of underlying undercurrent, what is really going on. And to me, with the word design, it's about the fact that whites have always felt a superiority complex over others, African Americans, Native Americans, those who did not look like them and speak the same languages. And as a result, they were in a position to suppress people, right? And to be able to, keep them at a level where they could be controlled. And using the federal government, using various statutes, using the state and local statutes has been a way that's been done for 150 years or some long period of time as such. And so what would you propose, or what are some of the proposed maybe solutions that you would possibly discuss with regards to that? Because the law is just the actual tool that's being used to continue to demean certain races, certain people, certain individuals. So what would you recommend if we're able to go in front of the Supreme Court and we are arguing our case as to, okay, well, this was initiated by the government for decades, and this is why. What would you say?
Well, let me first say that the Supreme Court doesn't make policy, it reviews policy.
Sure, absolutely.
And
It's
so
right. It's the
let me
judicial
go
branch.
back then and say what government should do. And we have to defend it in the Supreme Court if the government
Okay.
did something to fix it, but the Supreme Court wouldn't make up the policy. So let me give you an example.
Mhm.
One of the most powerful policies that the federal government used to create segregation in this country was the creation of all white suburbs, like the one I talked about a few minutes ago in Louisville, Kentucky.
Mhm.
This was mostly done in the post-World War II period when millions of returning war veterans were coming home, needing housing, and there was no housing available to them. And so the federal government embarked on a program to move all the white working class and middle class families who at that time were living in urban areas, many of them integrated urban areas. There was much more integration at that time than there is today, simply because we were a manufacturing economy. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts, ship their final products. And so black and white workers all had to live roughly in the same neighborhood to be able to walk to work. So the federal government began a program of moving middle class and working class white families out of urban areas into new suburban developments of single family homes. Uh,
Mhm.
these exist all over the country, in every metropolitan area today. Perhaps the most famous one is Levittown, east of New York City.
Mhm.
Um, you're familiar with that one.
Yes. Yes.
Uh, 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend William Levitt the money to buy the land and build 17,000 homes in one place at a time when we weren't yet a suburban country and the bankers thought that nobody would be crazy enough to want to live in such a place?
Mhm.
Levitt couldn't, he went to bank. Nobody would lend him money to do this. The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, getting his approval for a bank guarantee from the federal government. In order to get that bank guarantee, he had to commit never to sell a home to an African American. This was a federal requirement.
Mhm.
The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required him to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. Well, this was a blatant violation of the Constitution by the federal government in imposing these requirements and requiring that Levitt sell only to whites. Many African Americans could have afforded those homes. They were inexpensive. Levittown, you'll probably be shocked by this. The homes cost about $9,000, $8,000 when they were first built. These were modest homes, 750 square feet. Well, the white families were subsidized to move into these homes. As you know, you're in the real estate field.
Mhm.
Homes in Levittown or any of these other suburbs, all white suburbs are created, they no longer sell for $100,000. That's what $9,000 was in today's money. They no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families gained wealth over the next couple of generations from the appreciation and the value of these homes, equity, from their equity appreciation.
Right.
They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies. They used it to subsidize their own retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes.
Mhm.
African Americans were prohibited from purchasing those homes and participating in this wealth generating program. Well, African Americans at the time, returning war veterans, could easily have afforded to buy homes for $100,000. If you have it, that's about twice national median income. Anybody with a job, especially with a FHA and VA mortgage amortized, can afford a home for $100,000 today. But those homes no longer sell for $100,000. Those homes are now unaffordable to African Americans whose forebears were prohibited from buying them when they were affordable. Okay, so now I can get to your question. I'm sorry. The foundation took so long. So,
appreciate it.
What should the federal government do to remedy this constitutional violation?
Right.
Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever they cost in fair market value, and reselling them to qualified African Americans at deeply discounted prices to remedy the very specific constitutional violation in the way that those suburbs were created. So that's an example of something that should be done if we understand that we don't have de facto segregation. It was the government that created the segregation of Levittown. You know, Levittown today, we have a Fair Housing Act, as you know. We passed it in 1968. It's ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And as a result, Levittown today has, between 1% and 2% African American population. In a broader neighborhood, that's about 15% African American. So the difference between the 15% African American population that you would expect to have Levittown to have without this unconstitutional policy the federal government followed, and the 1% to 2% that it has as a result of the Fair Housing Act, that's the difference that has never been remedied, and that our Constitution requires that we remedy because it was unconstitutionally created. Now, you have a program like that. The Supreme Court would certainly evaluate it. Some people would complain. And in light of the history that I just described, they would have to acknowledge that this is a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation and should be upheld.
Got it. And I appreciate that. And, listening to what you're saying really reminds me of what is going on today. We are living in the results of what's happened in the past. And what I mean is this. I've had some previous conversations with different people about the African American culture. And to me, culture is largely created by the environment that you're in. And so in the beginning of our conversation, you spoke about students in school, right? And to me, if a child in their home doesn't have the proper learning environment to study, to be able to focus, then when they go into school, they're going to inherently be at a disadvantage, as you've mentioned. And when there is a wealth gap, and so many people think, oh, well, if I purchase a home, I automatically have wealth. And I'm like, no, that's not wealth. What wealth is equity, which you have pointed out, which is the difference between value and what a liability is. What that difference between what you owe and what something is worth is your actual ownership. And specifically in the African American culture, for decades upon decades, they haven't been able to develop a mindset and a culture of ownership. It's been of rentership. And as a result, a lot of self-worth for younger African American males and females has been, well, let me have some nice clothes. Let me have this nice jewelry. Let me go out and, let me sell drugs and let me raise up my social status. And I think a lot of that is a trickle down effect because they had never been taught about proper home ownership and had never had the opportunity of inheritance of ownership and taking care of your home and proper financial planning, to be honest with you. And as a result, having the families together. And so really there's a very deep socioeconomic hole that we're in that we have to really climb out of. And it makes me halfway sad and also very frustrated to listen to people, for example, and I want to say his name, for people like a Ben Shapiro or other people who say, no, systemic racism has never existed in this country. And it boggles my mind when you read the facts and when you read the laws, that have gone into this. So, yeah, please.
Well, if I may, let me disagree with you in part. there.
Please do.
I think what you described is partly true, but I think it's exaggerated. I certainly agree that we can make some progress by doing a good educational job in African American neighborhoods about the benefits of home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that no African Americans own homes today. About 45% of African American households are homeowners.
But that's versus 72%
That's right. That's
white.
exactly,
So that's a big gap
that's
there.
a big gap, and but we shouldn't say that nobody owns their homes. Now that's about it's less than a 2-to-1 gap.
Oh, absolutely.
2%.
It's less, right? Absolutely.
Less than a 2-to-1 gap, but the wealth gap is 20-to-1. African American wealth, household wealth, is about 5% of white household wealth, and that disparity, that enormous disparity, is in large part attributable to unconstitutional federal policy that prohibited African Americans who wanted to buy homes from being able to do so. So I think we need to do two things and not emphasize only one. One is we need to take steps to enable African Americans who want to buy homes to do so.
Right.
Homes that are now unaffordable, but that would have been affordable to their families, their forebears, had they been permitted by federal policy to do so. Secondly, we need to do a much better job of educating African American potential homeowners about the benefits of home ownership over renting.
Mm-hmm.
But both need to be done.
No, I agree. And truth be told, from our previous conversation, that's a large part of what I do. I consider, again, I like to use my growing skill set to be an advocate, to teach people, okay, well, what is your credit score? How is your credit score determined? Okay, what does that mean? And how can that help you purchase a home? How can you save money? Even, okay, you make $27,000 a year. Okay, well, do you want to purchase? Well, then let's work on a plan to get you there. What are you paying now in rent versus what would you be paying potentially in a mortgage to make sure that you're not house poor? What does that mean? How does the entire home buying process work? What does it mean to be an owner and the responsibilities of an owner versus the responsibilities of someone who's renting? That's something I do day in and day out with people. Not that I'm better than anyone else. I am one person, and I honestly just want to be able to do it one person or one family at a time. Because if that doesn't happen, then how in the world is it going to happen? So I am in 100% agreement with you, as far as that's concerned, because you're not going to really build true wealth unless there's some type of real estate, I guess, behind it. By and large, I'm not going to say by and large, I'm not going to say, for sure in all cases. And you also mentioned about, again, educating, potential homeowners, and would you recommend that maybe that there's some type of curriculum that's put behind that, maybe in high schools, colleges, middle schools? What would you say with regards to that?
Well, there are many home buyer education programs that directed particularly at African Americans that are being implemented by real estate agents in various parts of the country, real estate boards that are trying to increase African American home ownership. I think many of them are terrific programs. The National Association of Realtors has finally gotten on board with this program and is starting to provide materials for them. I would say this, though, and again, I fully agree with everything you said, but African Americans who have owned homes, those 45% of African Americans who have owned homes, have gained much less wealth from home ownership than whites who've owned homes. Because the only way, well, there are two ways you gain wealth from home ownership. You get some wealth if you stick in your home for a long enough period of time with an amortized mortgage so that you're gaining equity in your monthly payments, and an amortized mortgage. That is a wealth generating program. Really, an amortized mortgage is a forced saving program because part of your monthly payment, and the longer you stay in the home, the bigger the part of it is saving.
Right.
It's equity.
Mm-hmm.
But the other way, that's not the main reason, the main way that whites gain wealth from home ownership. The main way that whites gain wealth from home ownership is by living in homes in neighborhoods where property values were rising at a rapid rate. And typically, when African Americans have owned homes, they've owned homes in neighborhoods where property values rise at a slower rate. So even with the gain in equity that's comes with the forced savings and an amortized mortgage, African Americans haven't gained wealth from home ownership the way whites have. So the only way you get, when I was talking before about Levittown and all these suburbs that were being built, the returning war veterans who bought those homes with federal guarantees and subsidies, really, they had no idea that they were going to get wealthy from it. They didn't know that those homes were going to appreciate in value. In fact, if it was known that Levittown was going to skyrocket in value, none of those war veterans would have been able to buy the homes. There would have been speculators coming in gobbling them up before any homeowner could get them. So this was something that it was luck. It was completely unexpected. And the only way that African Americans today can gain wealth from the equity appreciation of their homes is if they happen to buy the homes in neighborhoods they're going to appreciate, that nobody knows today are going to appreciate faster than other neighborhoods. And that's a big gamble.
That is.
Certainly you're going to gain wealth from the forced savings and an amortized mortgage, but this additional big gain in wealth can't be predicted. So in terms of gaining wealth, I'm fully in full support of what you're talking about improving home ownership rates. But in terms of gaining wealth, we need to focus on income policies as well, so that people have other ways of saving in addition to expecting a windfall from the appreciation and the property values of the community where they live.
No, I appreciate that. Yep.
Yeah. So anyhow, yeah.
No, a couple of things on what you just said. The appreciation factor is extremely important because what do they say? What's the one word that's three words in real estate? Location, 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 right?
Right.
And location is all about speculation as far as I'm concerned.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
And so when you speculate, oh, okay, well, guess what? Whole Foods just did a feasibility study 3 miles down the road, and they're going to come there. And then all of a sudden you're going to build this new town center. Now you have some speculation. Guess what? Location, location, location that helps to appreciate because it makes them more desirable. And if you have perceived lower crime rates, if you have more blue ribbon 5-star schools in the area, you have a bigger tax base that can give to the schools. Like looking at all these things, you're so right and hitting it dead on. And I think we definitely need to educate people more on that because it's a large mix of factors that go into that. Mm-hmm. For sure.
There are many. Let me just say there are many reasons that it's good to own a home besides the expectation that you're going to get a windfall from appreciation. Homeowners take more pride in their communities. They're more invested in their communities.
Absolutely.
They're more active in their communities. They're more active in their local schools. They're better citizens because they have a stake in their community. So those are all good reasons to promote home ownership, quite aside from the gamble that they may gain a windfall from the excessive appreciation of home value in their neighborhoods.
No, absolutely. And as we begin to end off, I will mention something from a podcast that I did just the other week in keeping with the subject of wealth, right? And the wealth gap and wealth building. And one of the individuals had mentioned about, and I know this is not a topic that we're talking about today, but about insurance. And when you have certain types of insurances, whites have had certain types of insurances for decades that have been able to be passed down generationally as as non-taxable income, right? And the education just has not been there by and large for African Americans and certain immigrant populations. So as a result, they haven't been able to take advantage of that portion of wealth building and that portion of financial planning, as well. But I do firmly believe, from reading, your book and going through not only the broad laws that you've spoken about, but the actual specific situations, really, it brings it home and it gives it context, not in a sense where, okay, there's going to be this anger and this frustration and I'm going to put my fist down and do something about it. But I think there does need to be an indignation where, okay, how can we take step by step, right, to close this gap, to remedy this injustice? Because African Americans, Latinos, whoever, we're real people, right? With real families, real lives. And, that opportunity should be deserving of all people.
Yeah, I
For
agree.
sure.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, did you want to have any final words before we end off for our listening audience?
Well, sure. Let me make a plug, if I may.
Absolutely.
As a result of the the quite surprising but enormous attention that my book, The Color of Law, has received, a group of national civil rights, fair housing leaders have gotten together to form something called a new movement to redress racial segregation. I'm working with them on this. It's about to launch in the next couple of months to create local committees everywhere in the country, biracial committees of blacks and whites, to create pressure for the kinds of policies that are necessary to redress racial segregation. And if it's possible, I can give you a link where your listeners can sign up to receive more information about this launch of the new movement to redress racial segregation. And perhaps they live in communities where there might be soon a committee, a civil rights committee, to press for the kinds of changes that are necessary to fix this.
No, absolutely. Yeah, please. Well, offline, I'll get that from you and I'll distribute it to as many people as I can, for sure. So again, Mr. Rothstein, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for, just sharing your wisdom, sharing your research, sharing your determination to make sure that that light has been shown on a lot of the injustices of the past. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you very much and good luck to you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So everyone, this is our premiere episode of The Color of Law with Mr. Richard Rothstein. Thank you so much for checking us out. We'll see you again soon.